pictures without lipstick. Okay, now I'm ready for my close-up. I wasn't running away from home, I was running towards being a bohemian, and that's absolutely true. I was very lucky. I mean, you hear so many people talking about growing up in a dysfunctional family, and I grew up in a functional family. It wasn't dysfunctional, except, there were problems because to start with, we were Jews, we were very left-wing, and we lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly Irish, German, and Italian Catholic, and was extremely right-wing, very, very, not just conservative, but reactionary, very bigoted, very racist. And there we were. So I kind of was always an outsider. I was happy at home, but I was not happy outside of home. I didn't fit in. I didn't fit in school. I had very few friends. My father came to the United States from a little town in Russia. Well, it's now Belarus. At the time, they just called it Russia, because everything was Russia. He came at the age of 16, speaking Yiddish and speaking Russian, but not speaking English. He went to night school and learned English and was very, very, spoke English perfectly, but with an accent all his life, and was very well read. The house was full of books, and he had read them all. He also wrote, but he wrote in Yiddish. That was one thing he couldn't do in English. He wrote in Yiddish. And he wrote a book in 1938. This was a book that I thought, okay, this is lost. This is one of the lost books of the world. How will I ever find a book in Yiddish, from 1938? How obscure can you get? But you can find everything on the internet these days. And my daughter found the book. It was reprinted by Abe Books, which does that. They take obscure books and reprint them. So I bought them. I bought a number of copies, had it translated, and read it, and because I'd never even known what was in the book. I went, whoa, this would be so great adapted into graphic novel form. It's a series of short stories, really, almost like photos, like snapshots of the people from his little village back in Belarus, and a little bit from the 20s and early 30s, of his life and the people, really, that he had met and known in the Lower East Side, which is where he came to live, and also Brooklyn. And so what I did, this is published by Bedside Press, by a wonderful woman named Hope Nicholson. What I did was I adapted them into comic form, and not all of them. I took like the 12 best, adapted them into comic form, had a different artist illustrate each one. It's called A Million Yidden und andere Sachen, and I translate that as a bunch of Jews and other stuff. Also, there were problems at home too, because my father had Parkinson's disease, and my mother was supporting the whole family on a school teacher's salary, so you can just imagine. So I grew up poor, but it wasn't to the bone poor. I mean, they always made sure we had good food, even though they were both terrible cooks. But, we never went hungry. We couldn't always buy new clothes. We got a lot of hand-me-downs from relatives who were better off than us, and whose cousins who outgrew their clothes. But it wasn't that bone-grinding poverty. And anyway, the neighborhood I lived in was not full of rich kids. It was a working-class neighborhood. So, I had a good upbringing. I had a very good upbringing. There's such a romance about Bohemianism. And, I wanted to be an artist, and artists were bohemians. Artists wore berets. I have berets now, but I didn't have them when I was a kid. But that was what I wanted to be. I took French in high school so that I could go to Paris and live in a garret and wear a beret and be a bohemian. And isn't it interesting how clothes are always mixed in with it? It wasn't just being a bohemian. I had to dress like a bohemian. I had to wear black tights, and beret, and black turtleneck. I did find bohemians in New York City. I used to, on weekends, I would put on my black tights and go to the village and hang out as a teenager, 15, 16 years old, hang out at Washington Square Park, where there was this big circular fountain that they called the Circle in the Square. They still call it that. And where the folk singers would hang out with their guitars, and we would just hang out. I went to LA with a guy who at the time was my boyfriend. And, oh, no, I'm sorry. No, I went to California with him, but I went to LA myself. He went on to San Francisco. I went to LA because I had this stupid notion. At this point, I had been through a lot of very bad boyfriends. And remember, I was very young. I was 18. And there were things, I wish that my mother had warned me, but that's what people always say about guys and how they can just really just grind you down. I mean, all of these guys somehow took away my self-esteem and made me believe that I wasn't smart and that I wasn't talented. I mean, that's what happened to me, is these guys would just, and I was a bohemian, which meant that I thought you could be sexually free and you could sleep with whoever you wanted, because that was what bohemians did. But I didn't know that once I had slept with a guy, he would say, okay, now I'm your boyfriend. You can't date anyone else. I didn't know that. Free love part wasn't that free, because these guys would just lay claim to me and say, now I have a girlfriend, And that really happened, and I didn't know how to say no. I really didn't. I mean, I wouldn't know how to say no with a guy I didn't want to sleep with, but I thought it was okay to sleep with cute guys because that's what bohemians did. I didn't know that they would then suddenly say, okay, I own you. You know what I mean? So I had met at a convention this science fiction fan and science fiction agent. He was like a super fan named Fari Ackerman. And he convinced me that he would be my agent and he would make me a movie star. And the way I had to start was by posing for men's magazines, for pinup magazines, just like Marilyn Monroe did. And then I would be discovered and become a star. And at that point, I mean, the one thing I knew was that I was a babe. I was very good looking. And that was the one thing that had not been taken away from me. I no longer thought I was talented or smart, but I could do that. So I thought, hey, okay, I'll become a movie star, which is ridiculous because you don't become a movie star by posing for men's magazines. And the thing about those men's magazines, which I don't know, are there still magazines like that? I don't know. The thing about those magazines is once you've got your pictures in 2 or 3 of them, even 3 or 4, you're old news. They don't want you anymore. So it's a really posing for men's mag. At the time, it did pay very well, but it was an awfully short career. So that was when I met my then husband. I was working as an usherette at Cinerama for minimum wage. And it just so happened that he was editing a string of girly mags. And he had seen my picture and decided that I was his soulmate and that I shouldn't pose anymore for girly mags and that I should, move in with him and eventually become his wife. And that's what happened. Everyone suddenly had a band. And it was the new music. And it was a revolution. I mean, the 60s was a revolution. And I was there at the beginning of it because that was the beginning of the revolution, 64, 65. All these places were opening up. All these clubs were opening up that had just been, I mean, the Whiskey A Go-Go had been this tacky little place with go-go dancers, but Ciro's was an old nightclub that dated back from the 30s and 40s where the movie stars used to go there. And by the 60s, it really had become just this dusty old has-been place. But all of a sudden, it wasn't anymore. It was a whole different scene. It was the folk rock scene, the rock and roll scene. Well, we were folkies, but then one day, just like everyone else, in 1964, we saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that changed our lives. I mean, the thing about Jim is he really, God, the cops hated him, and he liked to provoke the cops. He really, he liked to take things to the edge and to see what would happen. My ex-husband, Paul, he had a twin sister, Jo, and they said, you have to come with us. There's this wonderful new group playing at Ciro's. This must have been 64, maybe 65. You'll really love them. And that was the Byrds. We went them to Ciro's, and they were incredible. We'd never seen anything like it. I mean, it helped that the Beatles had already opened up our minds. But these guys, they were doing folk songs, and they were also doing their own music, which was very, very good. And we met them. We went backstage and met them and became their friends. And all of a sudden, we could get in free to all these rock shows at all these clubs because we were kind of just became part of the right crowd. Well, it helped that my husband was writing for the LA Free Press, and he would write rock reviews. He did an interview with Bob Dylan from 1964 that you can actually still find on the internet. I was making clothes, and my clothes were extremely revolutionary, very, very out there, really great. I mean, they were great. And I was making clothes. I started making clothes because I had grown up so poor and loved clothes. Growing up, I'm wearing hand-me-downs. And I knew what I wanted to wear. So my husband, Paul, bought me a $100 sewing machine, and I learned to sew, and I was making these incredible clothes, and there's only so many clothes that will fit into your wardrobe. But I had all these ideas for things I wanted to make, so soon I was selling them. I was making them for rock and rollers, and their wives mostly, who loved what I was wearing and said, can you make me something like that? David Crosby brought her over. They both came over on motorcycles, and she was like Spats here. She was Ms. Friendly. And I always felt that she did that because she was so big, and that the first thing you judged her, the first thing you saw was fat girl, and she didn't want to be just fat girl. So she would like, hi, I'm Cass Elliot, and she was just outgoing and just everyone's friend, and you had to like her, you had to be her friend. And she couldn't get any nice clothes in her size, so I made her a couple of very psychedelic mini dresses.
My name's Mick Gray. I'm a comic book inker, a 30-year veteran with DC Comics and just inking comics. I'm a comic book inker. I think I met Trina maybe about 10 years ago or something like that. I know Steve, and meeting her was a wonderful experience for me. I've always been amazed at the energy. She has amazing energy about her. And whenever I get a chance, I do quite a few conventions. So whenever I'm at a convention, I love to meet her. I love her. I love to hear her stories because I'm a big music fan also. And I know that she hung around in the Laurel Canyon scene back in the day. So I always wanted to sit down with her and talk about her stories of those days. I know she wrote a book about it. But just the thing about Trina is her energy, the vitality of what she does, and I've just always, whenever I get a chance, I love to talk to her.
When that song was written, I was just visiting. I was in Laurel Canyon just for a month. I had visited. It was winter of 1968, February to be exact, and I came from New York just to escape New York. February is the worst time to be in New York. The weather is just, if anything, it's worse than it is in January. And I had boutique, and I discovered in February of 1967, I discovered that nobody bought anything in February. They've spent all their money already on Christmas and on New Year's, and plus the weather is so terrible they don't want to leave the house, and everyone's in a state of depression because they're so sick of winter, and they know that they have to go through one more month of winter before things start looking up. So nobody buys anything, and I completely understand understand. But then when February of 1968 rolled around, I decided, well, I don't want to just sit here in a store where nobody buys anything and the weather is so horrible. So I let a friend stay in my store, and I sublet my apartment for a month to another friend. I lived upstairs from the boutique, and I went to LA, where, it's very much like the Mamas and the Papas song 12:30, where they say, I used to live in New York City, everything there was dark and dirty. And also California Dreamin', when they say, all the leaves are brown and the sky is gray, but, I'd be safe and warm if I were in LA. So I went to LA for a month. And it's exactly like their songs. About ladies of the canyon, about Laurel Canyon, that song, Young Girls Are Coming to the Canyon, that's also from the song 12:30. And every time I hear that song, I remember all these young hippie women. There was the Sunset Strip, and then there was a road that diverged from it and then went up to Laurel Canyon. It was like the entrance to the canyon. And all these young hippies would be there, the women especially, hitching a ride up the canyon. And they'd usually get a ride as far as the general store. There was a general store there. That's the image in my mind, and I still remember that February of '68, when I came back, I was hitching a ride up to the canyon, and there was this teenage girl with me. She had gotten there ahead of me, so she got the first ride. And she was complaining because she'd been waiting for 10 whole minutes and no one had come by. And just then a car came by and offered her a ride. And I remember as she ran off to get the ride, she said, psychedelic. And I thought that was a riot, that she was using that as an expression, as the equivalent of groovy or something. Well, a lot of the rock songs had double meanings. And they talked about drugs. The hidden meaning was about drugs. For the most part, it was pot. Just talking about being high. But also sometimes they talked about harder drugs, like the Mamas and the Papas had a song. Oh gosh, I can't remember the name, but the lyrics were, "Baby, are you holding anyone but me?" Well, obviously. Holding meant you had drugs. And then they even said, I'm a real straight shooter, if you know what I mean. They were talking about shooting up, which I never did. I swear to you, I never did that. But pot, we all smoked pot. And it was when you heard a song that had references like that, are you holding? Or just all the songs about being high. I feel high when I see you go by. They're talking about being stoned, and those were messages they were sending directly to us because we understood. The Cinerama, which was this big theater. I don't think there is Cinerama anymore. They couldn't possibly be Cinerama anymore. But it was this huge theater, and it was the Cinerama Theater, which was like this huge kind of, the screen kind of went all the way around you so that it was a real, you kind of felt like you were in the movie. But they were showing the Battle of the Bulge, and it was a movie starring Henry Fonda. And it was a war movie, and we were all such peaceniks. Nowadays, I actually love World War II movies because I'm a real fan of World War II. But we were such peaceniks, we thought we have to protest this. So a group of us, including Henry Fonda's son Peter, got all dressed up in our best clothes, a lot of which I had made, and bought fake flowers and teddy bears in the thrift shops, and just went en masse to the theater. They had a display outside. Outside they had like dummies in World War II uniforms and tanks and guns. So we stuffed flowers and teddy bears into the tanks and guns, put flowers and teddy bears into the arms of the dummy soldiers, and had just a great time, until the manager came running out and said, "I'm calling the cops." And then we all fled, especially Peter, who just would have been totally, his father would have been so pissed off if he had gotten busted and it made the papers. And my ex-husband, my then husband, Paul Robbins, had climbed on top of a tank to stuff a teddy bear into it. And so he jumped down and he broke his foot. And we all had to carry him off to a doctor. Well, we carried him into a car, which carried him to a doctor. And when they finally took the cast off, I don't remember how long he had to wear the cast, but when they finally took it off, I commissioned a heart-shaped cake, iced completely in purple, and we had a Purple Heart party for him, a surprise party too, because he didn't know. When he came back from the hospital, we were all waiting with the Purple Heart cake, and I even made a medal for him. There were hippies and there were hippies, and there were all sorts of different kinds. And there were the ones who just got into really bad, dark places. And most of them, of course, he was evil. Charles Manson was simply plain and simply evil. But his followers were very young. And unfortunately, a lot of the young people, it was this sudden movement, and all these kids ran away from home, or at least left home, to be in San Francisco, to be in New York. And they were very naive. They were incredibly naive. They were open to anything, and it was like sheep. And the wolves got a hold of them. And he was one of the wolves, really, Manson. And what was actually very scary when all that came down was that a lot of the male underground cartoonists thought he was really cool. Isn't that scary? And a lot of the male hippies thought he was cool. I don't know if one could get exact and say every 40 years there's a revolution, but the 20s was a revolution. And I always think of it as it affected women, but men too. And then along came the 60s, and that was another revolution. Maybe every now and then things just have to shake up, or people just have to start seeing things in a different way. And, drugs did help. Not bad drugs. I never did bad drugs, but stuff like acid and pot. And by the way, it seems that it's no longer called pot, it's called cannabis. So I show my age when I call it pot. It does open your mind, and it did open our minds. And, we were also, of course, very naive. We used to speak really seriously. We really meant it about putting acid in the city's water supply and opening up everyone's heads. Can you imagine? It would have been terrible. But, we were very young and we didn't know. But it did help, and I'm not saying it didn't go bad also, because I remember back in New York when I had my boutique, there was this charming 17-year-old couple. A lot of them were very young. They had left home to become hippies, like the song, "If You're Going to San Francisco." This very nice 17-year-old couple that used to come and hang out in my store, and they were very nice. I even met her mother, and she was great. She had been a college professor. I think she still was a college professor. But one day, the girl came into my boutique with a whole story about how now that suddenly they had gotten hooked on really bad drugs, and she rolled up her sleeve and showed me her arm. It was awful. It was full of these suppurating little track marks where she had injected stuff, and she wasn't doing it anymore, but he still was. And she was afraid of him and afraid for him, and wondered if I could do anything, but there wasn't anything I could do. A lot of these kids, like I say, I was already on the other side of 25, but they were 17, and I was almost, to some of them, a little bit of a surrogate mother, I think.
I first heard about Trina when my first book came out at San Diego Comic-Con, and I went to the Eisners, and my eyes were open to how much I didn't know about comics and how much I had to learn about comics. And Trina came up on stage to receive an award, and she was a tiny woman in a little flower print dress, and she looked like someone's sweet grandmother. And then I found out how absolutely gnarly this woman is, and that made her all the sweeter because she's so unassuming in her flower print dress. But she's a firebrand. I love that about her. I really got to know her one evening at the Miami Book Fair. I was guest of Miami Book Fair, and she was too. And there was this final party at the Standard Hotel, and it was sort of, we were staying at this hotel, but this is where the party was, and everyone was all dressed to the nines. And I thought to myself, I don't want to, it was all networky talk, and I just was not up for it after this whole conference. So we ended up grabbing our suits and going in the pool. And so all of us from Top Shelf are swimming in the pool while this party's going on the bay. And, we're acting like yahoos. And who comes over but Trina? She's like, I don't want to be with the grown-ups. Can I hang out with you? So here's Trina. It's like 10 o'clock at night, and we're all sitting on lawn chairs in Miami around the pool, and it was just sort of magical because she's adorable.
Because I'm the queen of San Francisco thrift shoppers. Mostly what I do use the machine for is to take up hems, because everything is always too long on me because I'm so short. Or, if it's vintage, very often, if I find a fabulous vintage dress, especially at a thrift shop, there's going to be something wrong with it. So it's to fix the vintage dresses. I can think of two. One of them was it was at a thrift shop, and it looked like a rag. It looked like a pale yellow rag. But I looked at it and I went, that's silk. So I smoothed it out so you could see it because it was all crumpled and wrinkled. And I saw that it was a beautiful silk shirtwaist dress from the 50s made in Hong Kong. And so I bought it for like peanuts and brought it home. But then I discovered that almost every seam the thread had rotted away in almost every seam. That happens when things are really old. And so I had to re-sew on the machine every single seam. But now it's a wonderful dress, and I love it. Then there's another one that I could see again, it was a potentially beautiful shirtwaist dress from the 50s again, with a beautiful, great pattern, cotton. But it was mangled. It looked like the dog had maybe eaten the sleeve. Like her dog, the owner's dog, had just, you know what dogs will do. But it was so great. I brought it home and I patched it so neatly that you can't, unless you're really looking for it, you can't see the patch. And it's perfect now. This is the dress where the dog ate her sleeve, and I patched it, and I actually cannot find, I did such a good job that I can't find the patch. That's amazing. This has been hanging in the closet. I haven't worn it, and this is a seam that I had not resewn, and it has rotted out, and it's going to have to be resewn. And that's how the whole dress was. It was coming apart in all those places. And this is just an absolute winter silk dress made in Hong Kong from the 50s.
This dress in 1968, it was, hippies wore the American flag, but it was not cool. It was a political statement that you're wearing the flag, and it was not cool. And I got this fabric. I got yards of it at this one store, and he sold basically decorations, seasonal decorations, and this was for the 4th of July. And he was a little suspicious. He said, what are you using this for? And I simply said, decorations.
And then he let you buy it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is a dress made by Trina in 1970. If we look even closer at the arms, like the lace that's here, and then there's lace and velvet here, it's just beautiful.
I was pregnant with my daughter, Casey, when I wore this dress. It's from 1970. And there's really not much I can say about it. It's like all of my dresses. It's kind of a collage of different fabrics all put together.
And then I love the way that the sleeve always has that, and then it comes down at the end. And it's just beautiful. Did you tie-dye the fabric, or that's how
No,
the fabric
no, it's
came?
Indian and pre-tie-dyed. Tie-dyed in India.
It's beautiful, Bella. Okay, so this is a drapery that was made into a dress. About what year do you think, Trina?
1970, either 70 or 71.
Okay. It's
These
just...
were all mine. These weren't ones that I made for sale. But I mean, the ones I made for sale were the same, really.
Yeah.
But these were my favorites. I saved my favorites.
And then if we look at the lace on the sleeve, it's also antique lace. It's just beautiful.
Must have been in 2017 that I got an email from Prada saying they wanted to use some of my art in their summer line or the spring line. And I went, are you sure you mean me? I don't think she wants me. And she said, oh no, Mrs. Prada is a fan. I couldn't believe it. The entire spring line featured art by 8 different women cartoonists, and I was one of them. And I don't know how many others were smart enough to also ask for clothes. I know that I spoke with Joelle Jones, who was one of the artists, and she said she was very jealous that I had gotten clothes because she hadn't thought to ask. All she had asked for was one purse, which of course she did get. Under the theory that if you ask for too much, they'll give you some, I asked for one of each of the clothes in which they used my design. And she said, well, we can't do that, but we can give you 10 of your choice. So I picked 10. This is the dress. It's made out of a very, very heavy cotton. And it's a really good dress to wear to conventions, except that the cotton is so heavy that it's really hard to pack. It takes up so much room in the suitcase. This is the coat. It's a good fit. Inside is tucked into the pocket is one button and a statement that this is an authentic Prada. On the back, this is my Angela Davis art, except in the original she did not say right on, and it did, right where it says Prada here, it had said Trina Robbins. I had done this for the back page of a newspaper, feminist newspaper. It Ain't Me Babe, which is the first feminist newspaper published in the United States. I did it in 1970. At the time, Angela Davis was wanted by the FBI. And we feminists adored her. So we did a big back cover with this picture. And it said, "Sister, you are welcome in this house," with her name. And the idea was to put it up in your window. And people did. People did put it up in their window. So this is the coat that they made. So I had asked for the clothes, and it was in the contract that I could have 10 pieces, right? They came out. They got great reviews, and I was even starting to see. A friend of mine went to New York and photographed somebody she saw wearing this coat at Whole Foods. But they hadn't sent me my clothes yet. So I actually had to get a lawyer, send her a letter, not Miuccia herself, but the woman that I was dealing with. I never dealt with Miuccia personally, but the woman who was representing her. He had to send her a letter pointing out that it was in the contract that I got these clothes and they hadn't sent them yet. And she sent me an email saying, yes, we said we would send you the clothes, but we did not say when. So I waited for the clothes. So it must have been the 2017 San Diego Con. I get a text from my daughter saying, the clothes have arrived. And of course, I'm in San Diego, so I can't see them. But as soon as I got back, I unpacked them. They were in this wonderful, very, very heavy cardboard container. First of all, I only got 9, but I'm not complaining because 9 is still great. 9 Prada things. But it looked like what she had done. Like I had asked for specific items. Some of them were what I had asked for. Others were not, were like total surprises. So we decided that what she had done was just gone through the runway clothes after the runway show that showed everything, that she had just salvaged these pieces from the runway show. And for the most part, they were the size I had asked for. But this coat was gigantic, absolutely enormous. But it was a great coat, but there was no way I could wear it. So we took it to a tailor, and he lengthened the sleeves, and now it's Steve's coat. It fits him perfectly. So that's the story of me and Prada. Oh, and I was actually invited to the runway show in Milan, but I couldn't go because I was doing a signing and a reading at a local bookstore. And I knew that if I canceled, they'd never have me again. You know, they would say, oh, well, don't invite her to read and sign books because she doesn't show up. So I had to miss the runway show in Milan. Well, you know, there are, again, just like what I said about the hippie movement, there are two sides to it. In the beginning, it was an amazing, what a breakthrough. You know, I mean, it's so funny how these things don't occur to you. You know, but at that point, if you wanted to do comics, I'm talking about 1965, you know, the earliest part of the underground comic movement. At that time, if you wanted to do comics, there was nothing but superheroes. And if you didn't relate to superheroes, didn't want to draw superheroes, couldn't even draw superheroes, what could you do? Well, and it didn't occur to us. And suddenly it occurred to us. And that was really concurrent with the underground newspapers, because underground newspapers started in the early mid-60s, I would say, like maybe 63 or 64. Suddenly a newspaper that talked about us, we weren't even called the counterculture yet, but that talked about our culture. And some of those newspapers had comics, and gradually more and more of them had comics, and they were comics that talked about us, that talked to us about our concerns, about our lifestyles. Some of the really early ones, Ron Cobb. I hope he is still with us, I don't know, but he was a brilliant cartoonist, and he drew comics, well, political comics, for the LA Free Press in about 63 and 64. These were really the precursors. And it was just the realization that you could do comics that were not superheroes, or were not Mary Worth or Rex Morgan or Mark Trail, you know, those very boring comics that were papers. And then in 68, when Crumb produced Zap, that was another realization. It's so funny because they're just there and they're so obvious, but it takes something. It takes like a light bulb, you know, to look at Zap Comics and go, oh my God, not only can we do comics, but they don't have to be in underground newspapers. They can be in books just like Captain America or Spider-Man or Superman. They can be in comic books, an entire comic book of underground comics. I mean, it was a breakthrough, and it was brilliant. Okay, then it went bad. I mean, that really is what happened, because we didn't have a comics code. Obviously, we were free, and that was what the whole hippie movement was about, was being free. But unfortunately, it turned out that a lot of these guys had real, I won't even call it hostility, I'll call it hatred, had real hatred of women. And because they were free to express themselves, this was how they expressed themselves, with viciously misogynistic comics. And that's where it went wrong. And it became, in fact, because it was totally, you know, it was, I'll call it beyond male dominance. I mean, it was all guys with maybe me and another woman, maybe one other woman, you know. So they had, they controlled the field, and it became fashionable in underground comics to draw viciously misogynistic comics. When I was reading comics as a child, the only ones I wanted to read were the ones that had women or girls on the cover or as the leading characters. I was never interested in superheroes. I thought they were very boring. I thought that women were better looking. I mean, I still do. Women are better looking than men. Although, since the 60s and that taboo that men weren't supposed to wear pretty colors and bright clothes and jewelry and dye their hair and stuff, that taboo was lifted starting in the 60s. So now there are lots of men who are very pretty, but growing up, they were gray. Men were gray in their short hair and their gray business suits, and the women were bright in their red lips and their brightly colored dresses. They were simply better looking, and I wanted to look at women, and I cared about women. The superheroes bored me to tears. The superheroes with their short hair, they weren't attractive. Okay, I was talking about women being naturally caregivers, really. I remember during the AIDS crisis, I, of course, have a lot of gay and lesbian friends, and very sadly, a lot of the male gay friends had AIDS, and the lesbians wound up being the caregivers. Because, whether or not you want to have sex with men or whether you want to have sex with women, you're still a woman, and I do believe that men and women are different but equal. And one of the things about us is we are kind of natural caregivers. All right, so this is Marjorie Organ, and she was married to a very famous painter, and she herself drew comics for the San Francisco Examiner in the early 20th century, in the teens. And she, as you can see, she was very beautiful, and he painted her a lot. And this painting is hanging in the De Young. Now, it used to be that they didn't identify her. It just, because the title of the painting was Portrait of O. And of course they identify the artist, but they didn't identify her. So everyone just says, well, here's this beautiful woman. They don't know who she was. So I did, twice I did this with a pencil. I didn't write on the wall and certainly didn't touch the painting, but where they have the caption. I wrote on the caption, the woman is Marjorie Organ, who drew comics for the Examiner in the teens. And both times I did it, the guards were over there. I mean, before you could blink, the guards were over there. Don't touch that. And I said, I'm not touching it. I'm just writing, explaining who she was. And, they looked like they would like to throw me out, but I'd already done it, so what could they do? But now they identify her because I did that. Now, if you go to the museum, to the De Young, and see a painting, that's this painting of her, you'll see that it identifies who she was and what she did. A friend of mine who is in this book, Liz Schiller, this is my memoir. It was Liz who approached me at a San Diego con about wanting to do a pro-choice book. And this was after the Supreme Court had passed a decision. I don't legal name of it, but it's popularly called the Webster decision. And what that did was it put abortion laws into the hands of the individual states. Before that, it had been one law nationally. And of course, you didn't even have to be that far-sighted to know what was going to happen, and what was going to happen has happened. As predicted, there are states that are doing their damnedest to make abortion completely illegal, to give people a really, really hard time who need abortions. So we knew that was happening. We knew that was going to happen. I think this was 1990 when the Supreme Court passed that ruling. We knew that. Now, I had already done a benefit book. I had co-edited a benefit book called Strip AIDS USA. That was a benefit book for AIDS causes. I did that with Robert Triptow, who was the editor of Gay Comics, and with Bill Sienkiewicz, who is a brilliant, brilliant mainstream cartoonist and artist. That way we had the whole thing covered. I had the underground, Robert had the gay cartoonists, and Bill had the mainstream. And we made a lot of money. It was good. We made a lot of money for AIDS causes. So people knew me as someone who worked on benefit books. And when the Webster decision was passed, people were going, somebody needs to do a pro-choice benefit book, Trina. But I didn't have the energy. It took money. I just wasn't going to do it until I was approached at a comic convention at a San Diego Comic Con by this wonderful woman named Liz Schiller, who just happened to be the treasurer of Oakland Now, the National Organization for Women. And she wanted to talk to me about doing a benefit book. A pro-choice benefit book, and I went, yeah. I mean, I just needed that spark. Somebody, first of all, she was a treasurer, which meant she understood numbers, which I'm terrible at. And she even was the treasurer of Oakland Now, so that gave her, I forget what the word is, but, it made her proper. It made her accepted. So the first thing I did was I went to Ron Turner of Last Gasp, because he had published the AIDS benefit book, Strip AIDS USA. And in fact, he had been so wonderful that when I called him about publishing doing an AIDS benefit book, he didn't even let me finish my question. He just said yes. And that was great. So I phoned him about a pro-choice book, and he rejected the idea. He said, who would buy such a book? Well, the answer was 10,000 women. Well, men too, let's face it, men and women. Because we sold 10,000 copies. And I tried another publisher who, when I had done the AIDS benefit book, they had said, why didn't you take that to us? So I said, okay, I'm taking this to you. And they said no. So we said, okay, Liz and I said, we'll form our own publishing company. And that's what we did, to publish the pro-choice book, Choices. Very few comic book stores carried it. They would order maybe 1 or 2 copies. And when those were sold, they would not reorder. They didn't want anything to do with feminism. I remember that we went to 2 different feminist conventions, now conventions actually, and had a table there. My friend Robert Tripto, who was the editor of Gay Comics, he and I went, and took care of the table, and we were practically knocked over by eager women who were just dying to buy that book. So that's the answer. I mean, we didn't just sell it at Now conferences, but women's bookstores carried them. That's all in the book. But the thing is, when Liz read it, she noticed that I described what she was wearing when we met. It just happened to be a leather bustier, really great looking. And she said, whenever you write about people in this book, you talk about what they were wearing. And it's true. It's true. I notice what they're wearing. And it's part of the story. It's part of them. Oh, and Liz and I got both of us got very nice awards from the National Organization for Women for being, outstanding feminist activists.
My name is Summerlee Kashar. I'm the executive director of the Cartoon Art Museum. We are here at the Cartoon Art Museum in Fisherman's Wharf at 781 Beach Street in San Francisco. I met Trina Robbins when I first started working for the museum in 1998. She was an advocate for artists. She's always been an advocate for artists. She's been an advocate for women, and she's an incredibly knowledgeable person. I think she's helped us, I can't even say, like dozens of exhibits, a few exhibits that she curated herself. We can always count on her if I need advice or if we need help. She has collections, she's knowledgeable, and there are a lot of great stories about her.
My mother would get me the books out of the library. You had to be 7 to get a library card. So before that, my mother would get me these books. And she was getting me these, there was a section in the local library called Tips for Teens. And it was like YA stuff, basically. It wasn't really teenagers. The teenagers were already reading the romances or the bodice rippers. It was for the preteens. And I went right to that section. When I came into the library, went right to that section, picked out a bunch of books and brought them to the librarian. And she said, looking down at my 3-foot me, said, well, I think these books are a little too old for you, dear. And I drew myself up to my full 3 feet, maybe. I stood so tall that I was 3 feet 2 inches. And I said, my mother has been getting these books out for me, for the last 2 years. And after that, you were allowed 7 books. Every week, I would get out 7 books and I would stagger home under this pile of books, read them all, bring them back, get another 7 books. The comics were sold at the corner candy store. And my father would take me there for an ice cream. So, I knew the corner candy store and I knew they had racks of comics. But basically, as soon as I was old enough to cross 2 streets all by myself, because you had to cross 2 streets to get the candy store, I would go there with my allowance and buy one comic every week. Well, I'd always been drawing. I had always drawn. And once I started reading comics, it kind of hit me that I could actually draw comics. And I did. My mother was a school teacher, and she brought home an endless supply of 8.5 by 11 Board of Education paper for me. And I would fold it in half and have 4 pages and draw a 4-page comic. I usually didn't even finish them, because it's such an undertaking to draw a whole 4-page comic that I might get up to 3 or even, the last half of the last page. When I came to New York in 1966, I've been living in Los Angeles, and I started drawing. I started realizing, really, that these little decorative pictures I was doing were comics. It was after I discovered the comics that were being published in the East Village Other, which was the big underground newspaper in New York, and they had comics. And that was the first time I realized that comics didn't have to be Batman and Robin, that they could be, interesting things that came from your own head. So really, my earliest comics this is already a little sophisticated for my earliest. This is from 1970. My earliest comics were very unsophisticated. I drew them with a magic marker, and I didn't even know you were supposed to pencil, so I didn't. I just would start at the beginning and finish at the end. But they were very decorative, like these are. There'd be a lot of solid blacks and whites. My big influence was Aubrey Beardsley. I almost immediately started meeting the people at the East Village Other who were drawing comics for them. Yeah, the East Village Other did not pay. I mean, it was an honor to be published. To see your work in print was enough. You didn't even think to get paid. But then in 1969, Vaughn Bodie who is Mark Bodie's father, talked the publisher of the East Village Other into producing a comic tabloid that came out once a month. And we actually got paid $20 a page for that. And so that was the first time I actually got paid for a comic. That was really wow for me. For all of us, really. We were all new to it, because underground comics was a new concept. Well, by the time I was in San Francisco, it was pretty obvious that I wasn't going to make a living drawing underground comics at $20 a page. And so I started going to magazines, and I think probably the first magazine I sold to was National Lampoon. That was must have been like the later 70s. I was in New York at a comic convention, and I heard that Michael O'Donoghue, that he was, we had all read Lampoon, it was still new. I guess it was maybe the middle 70s, earlier than I thought. But anyway, he was at this convention, And I was, oh my God, I'm dying to work for Lampoon. And I went up to him and I totally blew it. I said, hello, my name is Trina Robbins and I really would like to work for the Harvard Lampoon. And he said, Harvard or National? I said, National. And he was very nice. And I visited the office the next day at his invitation. And he even went out of his way, they were all very nice to me, went out of his way to show me that, or to explain that M.K. Brown was a woman. And so they were not at all sexist. Well, their humor was very sexist, but in a very funny way, and I appreciated it. It wasn't nasty sexist. And in fact, when it comes to sexist, they kind of had me pigeonholed because I drew pretty girls. And so they had me illustrating some really hilarious but sexist articles, like, what do girls look like without their clothes? And I remember one of them was the Catholic schoolgirl, and it said, Catholic girls, schoolgirls never take off their clothes. And she was completely, in her little school uniform. I wasn't being treated differently at the conventions, but I realized very quickly that I was being treated differently by the guys who really, for the most part. Now, I have to explain that we're talking about 1979, 1969, 1970, that there was a little in-group of underground cartoonists. There were other underground cartoonists kind of around the sidelines, and they were different, and they did ask me. They were my friends, and they did ask me into their books, like what I just showed you here. I wish I could remember. Nicholas Cutie, I think was his name, C-U-T-I, and he invited me into his book. And I was just, because the little in-group didn't ever invite me into their books, I gladly drew for anyone who invited me into their book. And that was how I did this, because I think he sent me a letter. In those days we had letters, and he sent me a letter asking me to contribute. And so of course I did. I gladly contributed to anyone who asked me. So it wasn't the conventions. In fact, I remember my first comic convention was 1969, and I had been doing stuff for Gothic Blimp Works that I mentioned earlier. And that was really all. I hadn't done much of, and comics, of course, for the East Village Other. And I heard these two teenage boys talking, and one of them said, I hear that Trina is here. And I went, oh my God, people know me. It was really amazing. It was the first time I realized that people knew me. And it was at that convention that I was at, my very first underground comics panel. I think it was the first underground comics panel ever held. But what had happened, talking about being treated differently, was that there was this guy named Roger Brand, and he was an underground cartoonist, and he was part of the in-group, and he had a lot of authority because he had assisted a lot of the mainstream cartoonists. He'd worked as an assistant for them. So it seemed like he knew a lot more than us underground cartoonists. And he was asked to get together a panel of underground cartoonists. And he asked, at that point in New York, it was just beginning. You could count the underground cartoonists on your fingers without any fingers needing to be left over. He asked all the guys to be on the panel, and he didn't invite me. But I was talking with Phil Suling, who was a comics distributor, and he was the guy who put the conventions on. And I was talking with him, and I told him I was an underground cartoonist. He said, I hate underground comics. And I said, well, I draw this comic for Gothic Blimp Works called Panthea. And he said, oh, Panthea, that's the only underground comic I like. And Roger Brand happened to be in the room. So he said to Roger, you have to have her on the panel. And what could Roger do, because this was the guy who put on the con. So he said, okay. And that's how I wound up being on the first underground comics panel. The people who will be supportive to me find me. In those days, in the early 70s, 1970, 71, I was living alone with my baby daughter. And the only thing that kept me going, because the guys, I was not part of their world. They'd have parties and not invite me. They'd put together books and not invite me in. So I was on my own. But I started getting fan mail. started coming in little drips and drabs. And that fan mail, it's like it fed me. It's like I lived on that fan mail. I always loved paper dolls when I was a kid. I loved paper dolls, and I made my own. I had a good mother, like I mentioned before, who bought me paper doll books before I even read comics. And my big sister, one of my earliest memories, in fact, is I was only 4 years old, so, I was a little clumsy like kids would be, and I was playing with her Hedy Lamarr paper dolls, and I tore the head off one of the paper dolls, and she was so mad at me. It took her a long time to forgive me, and I didn't mean it. You're just clumsy when you're 4 years old. So I loved paper dolls, and I made my own. I would design my own paper dolls and design their clothes, and I would draw them over and over again, but the paper dolls were always in the same pose so that they could wear all the clothes that I had designed for them. I would keep them in a paper bag, a brown paper grocery bag. And the bag was like as full as a phone book. Well, actually, the first time I met Stan Lee was when I came to New York in 1966 and visited Marvel almost immediately to interview Stan Lee and write about it for my hometown paper, the Los Angeles paper, the LA Free Press, which was the LA underground newspaper. And in those days, it was so easy. I just walked up to the receptionist and said, "Hi, I'm a journalist for the Los Angeles Free Press, and I'm here to interview Stan Lee." And she said, "Just a minute," and went back. I happened to be wearing one of my own creations, and it was very short. It was shorter than what most of the women were wearing at that point. And I know, because it got back to me, that she said to the bullpen, "You should see what's up front." And they were very nice and let me in and showed me around. Stan Lee showed me around. Roy Thomas, who was the assistant editor, took me to lunch. I met all the guys. Everyone was lovely. I think they did appreciate my mini dress. So that was the first time. And by 1969, I had made friends with Flo Steinberg, she is alas no longer with us, but she was a very dear friend of mine. And she, at the time, was Stan Lee's Girl Friday, as they used to say in those days. Girl Friday? Well, it's based on Robinson Crusoe. When he found a native of the island he's been shipwrecked on, and because he met this native who became his assistant, he met him on a Friday, he called him Friday. And that's what the term Girl Friday comes from. They do a little bit of everything. They're secretaries, they're receptionists, they answer the phone, they file things away. They do a little bit of everything. And that's what Flo was in the beginning. She was Stan's Girl Friday. So I would visit her at Marvel. So I would see them all the time. Often. Okay, so this must have been 74. My daughter was 4 years old. I was living in San Francisco by then. But I would come back to New York for various reasons, just to try to sell comics, to visit friends, to go to conventions. And I took Casey, my 4-year-old daughter, I took her to Marvel. And we visited Stan Lee, and I knew she had a question. I said, "My daughter has a question for you." My little 4-year-old feminist daughter, she said, "Where are the women superheroes?" My daughter. And he reached over, he had a spinner rack of comics, and took out Ms. Marvel #1. And he was quite tall, and he telescoped himself down to her size and handed her the comic and said, "Now there are." And, that was such a lovely thing to do. And years later, I think just a few years before he died, I saw him at a San Diego Comic-Con and reminded him of that because he had, of course, completely forgotten. And he was delighted by the story, and he said, "Oh, you dear," and gave me a big hug. And that was the last time I ever saw him. They asked me. Isn't that uncanny? I was absolutely not expecting it. They phoned me and asked me if I would like to draw a 4-part Wonder Woman miniseries. And after I finished screaming, I said yes. If I do Wonder Woman, I really want to do the Golden Age Wonder Woman, because I didn't like what they had done with her. It seemed like each successive artist, we're talking about the 80s now, each successive artist just wanted to redesign her costume, and they made it briefer and briefer, and they managed to, make her breasts larger and larger, and I didn't like what they were doing at all. I mean, to me, Wonder Woman was the original Golden Age Wonder Woman. So I said, well, that's what I'd like to do. And they said, sure. Gee, that was easy. So when I worked on this, I had a stack, because of course I collect Golden Age comics. I had a stack of Wonder Woman comics, the original Golden Age ones, by my side for reference all the time. Like, how did he draw this? How did he do that? And I would thumb through them and find out. And also for inspiration, because I used Golden Age characters. This is Atoma, the Queen of the Atom World. She's one of my favorite villainesses. In the early Wonder Woman comics, the women, the villainesses, were always very beautiful. But the male villains were like little and twisted and warped. Well, that's me, Susie. Here's Susie. I didn't even realize until when I started that she was Susie. But there she is, classic little girl with the braids. She had, corn yellow hair, and so did I. When I was a kid, I had corn yellow hair and wore my mother braided my hair. My mother, who I have said is a school teacher, she would braid my hair every morning before school, and while braiding my hair, she would quiz me on my times tables. So, so we decided that she would have, I kind of co-plotted this with the writer. And we decided that she should have a little girl, to work with. And the little girl simply became me. While I was doing the first one, I realized, well, she's me. She's 10-year-old me, when I first discovered Wonder Woman. Yeah. So that was nice because, cartoonists and writers too, but especially cartoonists, they can play God. So like, if a cartoonist wants a teenage boy to be bitten by a radioactive spider and become a superhero, he does it, and it's true. In the case of, say, Tarpe Mills, who drew a wonderful strip for 10 years, from 1941 to 50, called Miss Fury, she drew a character who looked really exactly like herself, and even had a cat with the same name, because she had a fantasy of having adventures in Brazil fighting Nazis. So her heroine, Miss Fury, has adventures in Brazil fighting Nazis, and it's her. Gladys Parker, who I'm doing an entire book about, drew a character named Mopsy, who looked exactly like her. You can do that. Dale Messick, who drew Brenda Starr, the girl reporter, she didn't look like Brenda Starr, but she made herself look like Brenda Starr. The character she drew was a redhead, so she dyed her hair red and became her heroine. You can do that. This one, I did this for a benefit book after the Great Quake of '89. And it's basically, it's my idea of the goddess herself. And she's hearing these terrible things going on. I mean, she is the goddess, she is Earth, so it's going on her shoulder. It's all happening right on her because she is the planet. And she's hearing them say these terrible things like, bring back the death penalty, abortion is murder, AIDS is God's punishment. The one says, what rainforests? And so she's completely disgusted, and she tries to flick it off. But instead she flicks off in San Francisco, that being the earthquake, and she says, shit, I meant that for Washington, D.C. So there's my political statement. I guess it gave me a certain fame. I guess that would be the only way things changed.
Did you draw a lot of mainstream comics after that, or is that your only mainstream comic?
I really haven't, actually. I've been writing for mainstream comics off and on, and I'm writing something now. And I did get, they resurrected Wonder Woman appeared in the Golden Age. Besides appearing in her own book, Wonder Woman Comics, she also appeared in a kind of anthology called Sensation Comics, where she was on the cover and she had the first most important story. Then there would be other comics in there. So briefly in, I guess the 2010s or 2015s or something, they resurrected Sensation Comics, and I contributed to that, and that was great. The AIDS epidemic, I guess it was the early 80s, maybe the late 80s. If I had it in front of me, I could tell you. I think it was the later 80s. The AIDS epidemic, it was terrible. It was awful. And this was, Reagan was president, and he didn't even mention the word AIDS, and there was really nothing. The government was doing nothing, and people were dying right and left. And I lived in the Castro, I still do, which was a very gay neighborhood, and I had a lot of gay friends. And I have lost a lot of friends to AIDS. I lost them in those days when there was no hope. Not anymore. It's much better now, of course. But anyway, so I was in England at a convention, and this British guy, these two British guys, had published a benefit book for AIDS. They called it Strip AIDS. And I looked at it, and I thought it was a wonderful idea. But the comics they did, they were just comics that people had contributed. They had nothing to do with AIDS. They weren't on the subject. They were just some comic. Okay, I drew this comic, you can have it. And, that's nice, and it made the money for AIDS, but I felt I could do a much better job than that because the stories have to be about AIDS. So I went back to San Francisco, and the first person I contacted was Robert Triptow, who was the editor of Gay Comics, who was a friend of mine and really honored to be, a straight woman that contributed to Gay Comics. It was a great honor to me. I asked him if he would co-edit with me. And then someone told me that Bill Sienkiewicz, who is a wonderful, incredible artist who works for the mainstream, that he had been talking about wanting to do an AIDS benefit book. So I phoned him and I said, well, will you work with us? So it was perfect, really, because Robert got the gay cartoonists, Bill got the mainstream cartoonists, and I got the underground cartoonists. And between us all, we did Strip AIDS USA. It was published by Ron Turner at Last Gasp. Ron is an amazing guy. It was Ron who published the very first all-woman comic book, It Ain't Me, Babe, which I produced. And we're talking 1970 now. And he had just formed a comic publishing company. So I already had thought, I can do an underground newspaper, an all-woman underground newspaper. A comic rather. I can do that, a comic book. And I had talked to another publisher, the Print Mint, and they were interested. So I got the book together. Then I heard that Ron Turner was interested, and I phoned him and said, I have an entire women's liberation comic book put together here. And he came right over with a check for $1,000. And we're talking 1970, that was a lot of money. And so then and there, he gave me the money, and he took the book, the art with him. And in 1970, It Ain't Me, Babe Comics, the very first all-woman comic book came out. And 2 years later, he published Women's Comics, which was and I was a member of the founding mothers of women's comics also. I didn't do the whole thing. I was just one of 10 women who met in San Francisco and decided to do this all-woman comic book. And that was the longest running, still is, the longest running all-woman comic anthology. It lasted from 1972 to 1992, and Ron published that. So I phoned Ron. There were other publishers by this time, but I phoned Ron and told him that we wanted to do an AIDS benefit book. He didn't even let me finish my question. He said yes. So Ron is an amazing guy, and I will always, always feel that I owe a lot to Ron. You don't become an expert overnight, so I can't give you a specific date as to when I became an expert. But basically, by the early 80s, comics were just still, underground and mainstream they were both completely male-dominated. And editors would say, girls don't read comics. Well, girls don't read comics if there's no comics that girls want to read. Girls don't read comics if the only comics at hand are either undergrounds in which rape and murder of women is considered very funny, or mainstream comics that feature guys with big chins punching each other out. We're not really interested in guys with big chins punching each other out. Also, they would say women never drew comics. I don't want to name names because I don't want to. But a prominent Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonist once at a talk was asked by a woman cartoonist, because he was talking about the history of comics, was asked by a woman cartoonist, you haven't mentioned any women, where were the women? And he said, there were no women drawing comics in the early 20th century. So, I kind of knew that was wrong, and I knew that that wasn't true. And I was lucky enough, again, to have a publisher and a really good co-writer, because in those days, the first book that we did, which was called Women and the Comics, I was not yet confident enough that I could write an entire book myself. So I was very lucky because Catherine Ironwood, who was the editor of Eclipse Comics, and they also published books, wanted to do this book with me, and we co-wrote it. And Dean Mullaney, who was the publisher, is really a great guy and published it. That was the very first book on comics, and that dates back to 1985. What is now generally accepted as the very first comic written by a woman, and that's Rose O'Neill's comic from 1896 from a magazine called Truth magazine, called An Old Subscriber Visits. I think that's what it's called. An Old Subscriber Calls. And it's a genuine comic. It doesn't have speech balloons. All the copy is on the bottom, but it has panels. It has 4 panels. It's a real comic. And that is generally accepted right now as the earliest comic written by a woman, drawn by a woman. Want to know how I found it?
Yes.
Okay. My life is full of wonderful coincidences. I am, as I have already told you, an avid thrift shopper, but I'm also an avid garage sailor and flea marketer. I love these things. And there was a sidewalk sale right around the corner, and the guy had stuff. He was selling stuff from his front steps. They were all piled on the front steps. And there was a pile of magazines. Not a pile, I think there were about 5. Magazines, Truth magazine. And I already knew about Truth magazine because I knew that Grace Drayton had sold her first art to Truth magazine in the 1890s. She had drawn a cover for them. So I thought maybe there's some Grace Drayton in here. And they were selling them for $5 each. So I didn't have quite enough cash. I ran around the corner, ran upstairs, grabbed my money, and ran downstairs again, and bought each issue for $5 each. And there, perused them, and there inside was the old Subscriber Calls by Rose O'Neill, 1896. Well, what happened, the reason that I did my second book, at this point I think I've done about 5, the reason I did my second history was because Eclipse Comics were located in Guerneville on the Russian River. And along came the great Russian River flood of 1986. And they kept, in their building, all the comics they had were stored in the basement, and the basement flooded. So all copies of Women and the Comics, which had just come out, all the comics that hadn't already gone to the stores because they'd been ordered, were turned into paper mache, basically. And that was the end of that book. That's why it's scarce as hen's teeth and really hard to find. So, fast forward about 10 years to the 1990s, and I knew we needed another book because he couldn't find that one. So I went to Dennis Kitchen, who is another really nice guy who publishes Kitchen Sink, and I did it with Kitchen Sink, and this time, by 96 already, research was much easier because there were computers. When I did 85, there were computers, but there were these gigantic things that spewed out tape, and nobody really understood them except, a couple of computer whizzes. But in 96, I actually had use of a computer, which was wow, and so much easier already, even though there was no Google yet. But still it was easier, so much easier to do your research using computers.
I'm Andrew Farago. I'm the curator of San Francisco's Cartoon Art Museum, and I'm here in the museum's McLaughlin Reading Room. So she was the first woman to illustrate Wonder Woman professionally in the pages of DC Comics in the Legend of Wonder Woman miniseries in the mid-'80s. Trina has been one of the biggest supporters of the Cartoon Art Museum, and she has been from the beginning. So the museum was founded by Malcolm White and his friends in 1984 as a place to celebrate the art form, educate the public, and really foster an appreciation of this medium. And Trina, being a San Francisco mainstay, she was involved with the museum almost from the beginning. So offering her access to her collection, offering her expertise, her her insight, her guidance as an advisory board member and as just a friend. That's been great. I've personally, in the last 20 years, probably worked with her on close to a dozen exhibitions, and she's always incredibly generous with her time and her resources.
Okay, this little guy was 4 months old. Either last Christmas, I think it was 2 Christmases ago. What happened was my son-in-law decided he was going to give my daughter a kitten for Christmas. And I said, "Are you sure you want to do this? Because it's not a good idea, usually, to give someone a living pet when they don't know they're going to get it and when they haven't said yes they want it, right?" And he said, "Oh, no, she'll love it." And he said, "Can we leave him with you overnight and then she'll get him on Christmas morning?" So I said, "Sure." So this little guy, 4 months old, managed to completely endear himself with us in one night. He crawled on the covers with me. He was just the dearest little thing, and still is, of course. So the next morning, my daughter comes up the stairs, and she's furious because she doesn't want another kitten. She says, "We have 3 cats already, and they're seniors. One of them has diabetes and may not last out the year. I don't want another cat." So without skipping a beat, I said, "That's right, we'll take him." And I didn't even ask Steve. I told Steve later, I said, "Guess what? We took the kitten." And it was fine with him. And he's just worth his weight in gold. So, we're really, what a dear. Are living longer and longer. They're making it past 100, so I don't see why I can't. I have a simple goal, which is simply to live till 100. I don't ask for more than that. It was a mammogram that found my cancer, and it found it, early, thank God. Also, cancer moves so fast. It's very scary because it moves so fast. Because one year I had a mammogram and I had no cancer. The next year I had a mammogram and I had cancer, and that's how fast it moves. But luckily it was early, so I didn't have to lose a breast. I simply had a lumpectomy. But they did find that it had already spread to my lymph glands, I have to actually remember which, under this arm, left arm. And so they removed all the lymph glands. They had to. So that's so minor. All it means is that when I fly, I wear a compression sleeve so I don't wind up with elephantiasis. And that's such a minor thing, compared to dying.
Did you have chemotherapy as well?
Oh, God. I had chemotherapy. The whole thing takes roughly a year, really, the whole treatment, from surgery to the end. I had, I guess it was 5 months of chemotherapy. And then a shorter time, 5 weeks of radiation. And radiation is nothing. Radiation is a walk in the park after chemotherapy. I mean, what they're really doing, basically, is they're giving you a kind of a light dose of poison. Not enough to kill you, but enough to kill the cancer. And, and to make you pretty sick. So, yeah, chemotherapy, it's not fun, but it sure is good to be alive, so it's worth it. Well, of course, I lost my hair and was bald as an egg. So, and I did get wigs. I got the American Cancer Society. Folks, they're wonderful. They give away wigs. They give you free wigs. Now, at the time, before I lost my hair, I had curly red hair. And in fact, the day that I hadn't lost my hair yet, but the day that I got my first wig from the American Cancer Society, on the way home, someone actually stopped me and complimented me on my hair. I used to get compliments on my hair, people telling me how beautiful it was, and I almost burst into tears because there I was with the wig, knowing I was going to lose the hair. But they're wonderful, the American Cancer. I can't say enough about them. They also got me free taxi rides for my treatments. They really do a lot for you. The first time I went to the American Cancer Society in San Francisco, and I found one curly red wig that worked. And she said, well, the one in Oakland, the Cancer Society in Oakland has more wigs. So I made an appointment to go there. And she had phoned ahead, and they had taken out all their curly red wigs. They were ready for me. And there were 3. And I had a hard time deciding. I finally picked one, and she said, take them all. We don't have that much of a demand for curly red wigs. And that was when I burst into tears. And I'm almost going to start crying again. It was, by the way, they have a ready supply of Kleenex. Because I'm sure I wasn't the only one who burst into tears. But wigs were a disaster. In the end, they are so high, such high upkeep, that really, by the end of the year, the last time I wore one of the wigs, it was like a rat's nest. I mean, they're very hard to take care of. Even washing them, gently shampooing them and brushing them out, they're awful. Probably a professional. I bet Dolly Parton has a professional wig keeper, who takes care of hers. So really, I only wore them to conventions. I only wore them to public events where I had to look really good. Because one thing that my nurse practitioner told me this when I first started losing my hair and I was going to a convention. I said, oh no, what am I going to do? I'll show up bald. She told me about the American Cancer Society, and she said, you don't have to tell them you have cancer. You don't have to. And I decided not to. I picked 40 good friends who I informed of my, my progress via, the internet. But I decided, yeah, that's a good idea, because publishers are going to, when they find out I have cancer, they're going to say, oh no, we can't hire her. She's going to die. She won't complete the book. So I didn't tell them. And I actually did write an entire graphic novel during that year. But anyway, wigs were a pain in the ass. And scarves, I never got the hang of how to tie a scarf, those really fashionable scarf ties that you see on some women. I never got the hang of that. So hats. So I wore hats and I started collecting them. And you know, I just haunted thrift shops and found fabulous hats, and now I have too many hats. Steve was a saint. Steve was supportive and a saint, and he did all the cooking. At a certain point, I just couldn't cook anymore. Sometimes I would feel strong enough and I would cook, but for the most part, he did. And he was such a saint because it's really hard on your digestive system. Even onions, cooked onions, of course, even onions made me sick. And he had to cook the blandest foods, things that didn't even have onions in them. He was a saint. I wish somebody would have told me in the beginning about chemo nose and chemo eyes and even chemo brain. Because it, you know, the chemicals affect you. It's a poison, like I say. And they're killing every single fast-growing cell in your body because cancer is a fast-growing cell. So they can't single it out and say, we want this fast-growing cell. So they just take all the fast-growing cells. And that's why your hair falls out. That's why your fingernails and toenails die, because they're all fast-growing cells. And my toenails, in fact, totally, by the end, they had turned white. And they just fell out. And it's not painful, by the way, because they're dead. So they just literally fall out. And they're pushed out by the new nails that are healthy, that are alive. This is after the chemo. But anyway, there are tiny little hairs in your nose, in your nostrils. And they filter out things. And they also filter in things. So what was happening was my nose was running like mad. I couldn't, if I bent my head, liquid would just pour out of my nose like out of a faucet. And that was because all those little hairs were gone. And then my eyes were tearing like mad. And that's because my eyelashes were gone. So yeah, I had to learn that myself. And you even get chemo brain, which means your thinking gets a little fuzzy. A friend of mine who survived non-Hodgkin's lymphoma told me that afterwards, that what chemo brain did to her was she had to do the New York Times crossword puzzle with a pencil. She couldn't do it with a pen anymore. Well, that keeps one's spirits up. Doing a graphic novel, working keeps one's spirits up. Writing a book, writing a graphic novel. You have something that you have to do, and you enjoy. Also, it's something you enjoy doing. I have taken dancing classes for almost my whole life. I have taken dancing classes, and I found that the first week, the way chemo works is the first week after your chemo, you really are good for nothing. But then slowly you build up, so that by the fourth week, I think, is it every third week or every fourth week? I've already forgotten. But by the time you're ready for the next session, you're feeling really, comparatively decent again. So I missed a lot of tap classes, dance classes in general, because the first week I just couldn't do anything. And I missed some fun opportunities. A friend was coming into San Francisco to see Leonard Cohen and asked me if I wanted to go. And I said, that's 2 days after my chemo. I just can't. So I never got to see Leonard Cohen. And then he went and died.
Well, we met a long time ago. Just as a young comics fan, I'd go to comics conventions and there'd be all the other cartoonists around. And just being in the same city at the same time, eventually meet everyone. And after a certain point, we realized we had an awful lot in common. There weren't a whole lot of women around that knew who, say, Al Feldstein was, or Jack Davis, or Wally Wood, and could talk about EC Comics and all of that kinds of stuff. So we found out we actually had quite a lot in common. Well, it wasn't really planned. I mean, how do you plan these things? We just got together and it just worked out really well. So here we are, and it's been, how long has it been? More than 40 years. I think we've been together since about 1977, I think. Yeah. So it's been a long time, looking back on it. But it helps, living with someone who's doing similar, not exactly the same thing. She writes histories of women artists. Anyway, lots of similar, interesting projects that I don't really work on, but it's fun to watch. I mean, she has a collection of women cartoonists, and the walls in our house are lined with really fabulous stuff. She has a fondness for cats. We do have a house full of cats. We tried to keep it down to 2 cats, but they keep multiplying, and now we've got 3 cats, and who can say how many we'll end up with. But that's fine, because I love cats too. I mean, they're actually a great distraction, and they help me in my work. So, by sitting on the artwork. I've been a comic book artist, working for Marvel Comics and DC Comics since the 70s. Started out as an inker and became a penciler, and spent the last 40 years alternating between penciling and inking stuff. Warlock, Howard the Duck, the original Star Wars movie adaptation, worked on Superman, Batman, drew the X-Men, worked on Fables for the entire run of that. Currently working on a graphic novel myself, but I keep busy. I think the closest we did was for the DC Who's Who, where she drew Cheetah. She drew the Golden Age Cheetah, and I did at the time, the current version of the Cheetah. So there's 2 versions of the Cheetah that we got to draw. But no, we haven't done any superheroes. Oh, now that you mention it, I just remembered that I drew an issue of the She-Hulk, and she was a fashion designer and had her own boutique and made her own clothes, so there was a whole section where the She-Hulk needed a new ensemble. And anyway, she penciled a fair number of pages on that I did the inking on. So that was fun. But generally, we haven't really collaborated on a whole lot. These days, she's just writing, and occasionally we'll work together that way. She did a book, A Minyan Yidden, which were stories adapted from her father's writings about growing up in Russia. And I drew one of the stories for that she did the script to. So we do occasionally collaborate on things, but we have our own projects that we keep busy in the same house, us and our cats. I've always felt that the male-female thing, that we're all equal in that sense. So to me, that was never an issue. I mean, I'm happy with women doing things. I mean, I'm working in a business that is sometimes seen as rather misogynist, but I've managed to work with a great many editors, for example, that I've worked with were women. Fabulous editors. I just find creative people interesting. So,
Just in every way in your life. And it isn't just about feminism. It's about homophobia. It's about ageism. It's about racism. It's about, even as far as I'm concerned, species centrism. Because we're not really better than the animals, and people really should not have the right to shoot something that's more beautiful than they are. Schindler's List came out, but I was so moved by that movie. We saw it on New Year's Eve, of all things, the year it came out. And I took a vow that I would always speak out, that when I heard sexism, racism, homophobia, ageism, all of the isms, anti-Semitism, how could I forget that? That I would always, always speak up. And I have always spoken up, and that's what we do. We don't let it go by. We don't let remarks like that go by. We just speak up. Oh, we've made enormous progress in feminism, in every ism. Of course, I realize I live in a bubble, and in Louisiana, things are probably not as they are now. Although I've had some real surprises. I was a guest at a writers' conference. No, I'm sorry, at a literary festival in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I thought, what am I going to encounter here? I mean, Little Rock is famous for being the place where segregated teenagers in the 50s were finally allowed to go to high school and met with incredible, really, really negative reactions and threats of violence. But Little Rock now, the high school where it happened, the historical high school, has a museum attached to it that tells the whole story and sells graphic novels. In fact, they had The March, for instance, really, really good graphic novels about the civil rights movement. And they have charming cafes and nice little boutiques, and it's a lovely, lovely city. I thought it was the Southern Berkeley. So, even one's ideas about the South can change. I mean, this is a city that owns up to what it was and says we're not like that anymore. Have we made progress? Yes. God, yes. I mean, okay, in comics, there are more women drawing comics now than ever before. And that's the whole country, so that's not just a bubble. And their comics are wonderful, and their comics have opened people's minds, because there was a time when if you thought comics, you just thought of Zap, Pow, Bash, guys punching each other out in their little skin-tight outfits. And you thought of a certain style, too, and that was a very male style. It wasn't a female style. But when women are starting to draw comics more and more, not even starting, they're there. That's a female style, and I do believe that men and women are different, and I do believe that women draw differently than men. And it's for me and for girls and women, it's a more friendly style. You look at it and you want to look at it. It makes your eyes happy. But in so many other ways too, I mean, again, I do live in a bubble, but we're all conscious of homophobia. We're all conscious of racism here. I realize I shouldn't say we're all, because there are exceptions, but in this wonderful bubble of San Francisco, where I'm really, really grateful I live, we've made enormous strides in every way, in racism, sexism, homophobia. Even, I think, species centrism, because this is a city of people who really love their animals and would never, never. Again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, you go to the dog park, you can see the love they have for their dogs. And although our cats will never allow us to have dogs, they have basically told us this, we love the dogs in the neighborhood, and we know the names of the dogs better than we know the names of their owners. What is feminism? What is feminism? God, it's everything. It's we are all equal. That's the very simplest. And therefore, if we are all equal, we need to be treated equally. We need to be given the same equal opportunities. But it's more than that. It's not being ashamed to be a woman. It's not feeling that because you're a woman, you're not as good as men. Because for centuries, that's what has been shoved down our throats. Women, it wasn't until later in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century, that they finally had colleges for women. The argument against colleges for women was that it would just be too hard on their poor little brains, and they would get brain fever. And when I was a kid, and we were supposed to be equal by then, right? Women were even served in the armed forces at that point. We thought we were equal, but we knew A woman could be a nurse, but not a doctor. Of course, there was the occasional rare doctor, but basically, a woman could be a nurse, but not a doctor. She could be a secretary, but not a CEO. She could be a stewardess, but not a pilot. I mean, and we took this for granted. We took this for granted because we'd been brought up that way. And when the teacher in school told us that if you were born in the United States, anyone born in the United States could be president, we knew that it really meant any male born in the United States could be president. So it's so much of that. And then it's also sexual. It's we don't have to be eye candy. And we don't have to look pretty for men, and we don't have to smile when they say smile. We don't have to. And we can say no. You know, as a teenager, it was really hard on me because I didn't know you couldn't say no. I mean, it was, if you said no, it meant you were repressed. For me, feminism also means that I'm really more interested in women than men. There are men that I love, you know, Bernie Sanders comes to mind, Barack Obama, my very own partner Steve, and lots of other guys, my brother-in-law, who's a really great guy. I have lots of male friends, but my biggest interest is women. And there was a time in 1970 when my then partner, my daughter's father, said to me, "You always just draw comics about women. Why don't you draw one with a man?" So I thought, gee, maybe I should. And I drew this one comic, and it was terrible. It was just a mass of cliches. It got published, but I hated it. And I realized that's not what I want to do. Why I don't draw comics about men is because I don't want to. Because I'm interested in women and want to draw and write about women. And because women have been sadly neglected. That's why I research women cartoonists. Because all those years that comics histories have been written, had always been written by guys, and the guys didn't care to write about women. In fact, they really believed, and the only reason they could have believed this is because they wanted to believe it, that there had been no women cartoonists in the early 20th century. And we know this is absolute bullshit. And there's probably a million other reasons, but that's what comes to mind right now.
I've been involved in hundreds of projects with Trina over the years. What really surprised me was when she began being more of an art historian than an art creator. I was very, very impressed. She began doing a few articles about cartoonists from the 20s and 30s, and then began producing the amazing work of women cartoonists throughout history. And the amount of the research, how she was very determined to meet these people if they were still alive or meet with their relatives, really impressed me. I thought that was a very wise move on her part as far as her own career. And it's a service to all of us. She did shows of us that went to Europe and Canada and all kinds of places in the United States. So often, because she was doing all this running around, and she's great at making contacts, she was very valuable in getting us known, women cartoonists, getting them known throughout the world.
I actually have 2 books that will be coming out in 2020. One of them I'm completely finished with, and the designer is working on it. And that is, again, my histories of women cartoonists. I think these 2 might be the last 2. I think I will have done, at that point, all the women I want to write about. But the one that's completely done and that is sitting at the publishers is called Gladys Parker, A Life in Comics, A Passion for Fashion. And she was this amazing woman who drew a character called Mopsy. And Mopsy just happened to look exactly like her, and she just happened to look exactly like Mopsy. I mean, it was a case of where does the artist stop and the artist's work start? They were just tied together. And it was a very successful. Mopsy was a very successful strip. Lasted from about 1937 to 1965. She died in 66. But then, throughout the 30s, Gladys Parker also was a clothing designer. And she had a label. She made high-end clothing, beautiful high-end clothing, under the Gladys Parker label. She sold her clothes. Every big city, every major city had one high-end department store that sold her clothes in the Mrs. department. They were for younger women. Although I'd kill to own one, and if it fit me, I'd wear it. What is clothes for young women? What does that mean? Oh, and she also drew her own ads. This is the only case of a designer drawing their own ads for the newspapers for the clothes. So, and of her women, of course, all looked like Mopsy. So people looking at the ads would see Mopsy wearing these clothes. She sold her work very well. She also would make appearances one day only at each department store. And if you bought one of her dresses, she would actually draw you in the dress. And God, if I could go back through time. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Then in 1940, she packed up her 2 black cats and moved to Hollywood, because this was all in New York. She moved to Hollywood, where she designed clothes for movie stars, like Barbara Stanwyck, Dorothy Lamour, Hedy Lamour, really. And, along with everything else, was designing clothes for movie stars, never stopping her strip Mopsy. Okay, that's one book. The second book, I'm finally writing specifically about the women who drew flapper cartoons in the 20s and 30s, because this was very revolutionary. The flapper was a revolutionary concept, and the new woman of the 20s and 30s was the product of a genuine revolution. If you can imagine comparing a woman from 1925 to a woman from just 10 years earlier, 1915. Now, 10 years earlier for us is 2007. Everything was the same, except we had a better guy in Washington. Much better guy. But, there was no major change. From 1915 to 1927, 1915 skirts were just above the ankles. And everyone thought that was really daring. Women were corseted from under their arms to their hips. Women didn't have the vote yet. They got the vote in 1920, the national vote. Skirts went up. By 1925, they were at the knee or over the knee. The corset was thrown away. Dresses were very comfortable, straight up and down. Women were drinking and smoking with the boys. In 1915, a woman smoking in public, that meant she was a loose woman. A woman wearing makeup in public. Okay, the movie stars wore makeup, but for the most part in 1915, the average woman didn't. By 1925, they're wearing this bright red and sometimes really dark red lipstick. They're definitely smoking. Not that smoking was good, but that smoking was a sign of emancipation. So I'm writing about the women who chronicled these women, the flappers, and it's called The Flapper Queens. It's going to be published by Fantagraphics, and that's the one I'm working on right now. I'm also writing a 3-part comic, three comics, a mini-series, I guess you call it, for Marvel, and bringing back a Golden Age superheroine in that comic. And that is a lot of fun. The Golden Age superheroine is Blonde Phantom. Little known, little remembered in these days, although there were a couple of vague attempts to bring her back in the 90s, but they were not good, and they didn't do her justice. Actually, I killed Blonde Phantom. I started at her funeral, but she just happens to have a granddaughter who looks exactly like her. And I'm not going to get into the plot, because I'm just starting it. But basically, I always loved Blonde Phantom's costume. It's extremely impractical. She fights crime in red high heels and a red evening gown with a slit up the front so you can see her leg. But it's just darling. It's a great outfit, even if it's completely impractical. And her Blonde Phantom's granddaughter inherits the costume, and it just happens to fit her perfectly. And I will say no more. We will, yes, because I'm a hopeless optimist. I have protested. I have marched in protests since the civil rights movement. Politically, I'm really kind of milder than a lot of people I know. I mean, I have a friend who was one of the people who chained themselves to restaurant counters in Woolworths in the civil rights movement and got arrested. I have another friend who was a freedom rider and got arrested. This is like, we're talking 1961, you know. She was a 21-year-old college student. And all I ever did was march and protest, so that's mild considering. But man, you know, civil rights movement, Vietnam War, pro-choice, you know, it could go on and on and on. And, you know, I was at the Women's March in 2017 in Washington. That was wonderful. It's glorious. The interesting thing about Trump is he is responsible for so many women becoming feminists. Women who used to, you know, the kind of women who always go, I'm not a feminist, but, you know, for finally women who said, you know, fuck this, I'm a feminist.